couple big pieces to report this morning. So first of all, last week we brought you the news about Kaliningrad. It's this sort of like this strange piece of territory that
it's an exclave, by the way. I misspoke. Not an enclave, it's an exclave.
An exclave. I've never heard that word. It's a good word. So it's separated from Russia. And a lot of their goods, but it is part of Russia, a lot of their goods to get into Kaliningrad have to go through Lithuania. So Lithuania has now, they say pursuant to EU sanctions, blocked some of what is going into Kaliningrad. Now, there are competing claims about how much is being blocked. Russia seems to be using this as sort of like a focal point and a lightning rod for their own population to say, see, look at, the lengths that these Westerners are going to.
NATO is specifically doing.
Yes, but there's no doubt that some goods are ultimately being blocked. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. This is not anywhere close to resolved. The headline here is from the BBC says, Kaliningrad row, Lithuania accuses Russia of lying about real blockade. The Kremlin is condemning these sanctions as illegal and unacceptable. The leader of Lithuania is saying that passengers are still able to travel freely across Lithuanian territory, and only about 1% of Russian freight was affected. So listen, the point is, and also here's another piece that's important. Further sanctions are actually due to kick into place in August and again in December, covering things like luxury goods and crude oil. So whatever they are blocking now, they're set to block even more in the upcoming months. But really, whatever the reality of the situation is, this has become another one of these flashpoints, Saagar, that with very unpredictable ultimate outcomes.
Yeah, and so right now, actually, the G7 announcing new sanctions on Russia. Let's put this up there. They're going to go ahead and ban imports of Russian gold. That's in order to try and go and impose even more costs on the Russian economy. This was kind of an expected one that they were going to go ahead and say, because gold is actually the second largest export from Russia after energy. It's a major source of revenue, actually, for Putin and for Russia. But I just think it always comes back to this. Okay, yeah, the G7 can ban it. That's fine. But guess what? The G7, while comprising a significant portion of the world's economy, is not the entire world economy. And as we have learned with oil, unless you have all 195 or 4 whatever other countries on board, well, it's not 100% clear that this will work. I'm not going to say that the sanctions haven't been effective in some means. Russia did just default actually on its debt for the first time. This was a triggered default of debt as a result of blocking them from being able to pay certain times in enumerated US dollars. But the Kremlin is saying, look, we didn't default on our debt. They're doing it because they were not able to pay it based upon the sanctions that you've given us. So it's not like we're unable to pay our debt. It's just that you won't let us literally pay it in our denominated currency.
Right,
and
they want to pay it in rubles.
Yeah, they're like, we want to pay it in rubles, so why don't you just take ruble, which right now is floating actually quite high to the thing. Anyway, so these are all instruments in order to try and hit back against the Kremlin's managed currency, which they're doing everything they possibly can in order to keep the ruble high. And just remember, they're printing money on oil, printing more money than they have ever seen before, far more than they actually need in order to conduct the war. Even in terms of their consumer economy, I hate to say it, but they seem to, they're certainly suffering, but McDonald's over there was taken over by a Russian chain. And apparently they sold more burgers than they ever have in their history.
Really?
On their first day that they reopened, they have some Russian name or whatever for it. I'm sure it doesn't taste as good, but look, so they still have McDonald's. Some of the other state assets or some of the other private assets that we left behind, Western companies, are just going to get nationalized, kind of like what happened in Venezuela. But I think part of the problem is always going to be is this isn't Venezuela. Russia is a, second world, almost first world country. They have a major intellectual, technical know-how. They are going to be able to operate these in some form. The Iranians got by for 40-something years, by being sanctioned to death.
Powerful friend in China as well.
Right, they have some equipment in China. They're going to be able, yes, is going to scramble the global supply chain, especially for oil, and they're not going to be able to have the same parts they've usually been able to rely on. But they also know that if their gas infrastructure goes down, the West's gas prices go up. So there's a lot of interplay that I think is still happening at the bottom level. But the most significant part that we really have to focus on here. Yeah, go ahead.
There's one other piece on the sanctions front that I think is important because I I think the West has realized that the oil sanctions a lot of these sanctions have backfired, as you were saying. Like Putin's regime richer than ever, raking in record-breaking oil profits. And so they're trying to figure out how to deal with this. And one thing that they're floating at the G7 is what they're calling a buyer's cartel. So basically, the same way that OPEC colludes to set what oil prices are going to be and how much they're going to pump, whatever. It's the same idea, except on the other side. So you get a bunch of countries together, they band together and say, we're only going to buy at this price to effectively cap the price that they're paying for oil. Right. Now, it's complicated how this would ultimately work, if it would ultimately work. I think a lot of people are concerned about what the ultimate impact could be and whether this is going to be effective. But there's a clear recognition here. Number one, Europe very dependent on Russia for energy. And so they're kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too by saying, like, we're going to get your energy, but we're going to get it at the price that we want. Because
that's how it works when you buy stuff.
Right. Well, and I mean, again, I said this last time. I do think it's funny that, like, if you said the word price controls here in the U.S., you'd be treated like a knuckle dragger. Yeah. Like, you can't, this is insane and against every economic or whatever. But then when it comes to, like, trying to punish Russia, they'll throw their economic orthodoxy out the window and do whatever it takes. So they're considering, apparently pretty seriously, trying to implement some kind of regime like this. Now, I mean, Russia could just say no. But
it could play a game of chicken.
Yeah, and they could say, listen, we got buyers over here in China and India that we're happy to do business with, so we're not playing your games. So it does create some risk there as well, but that's what's being floated right now.
Look, it's basic econ. You're like, hey, I'm only going to pay you X. You're like, okay, well, I'll fulfill your demand up to the point where it makes sense for me, and then I'll fulfill demand somewhere else. So, okay, yeah. I mean... This is effectively what it's going to do is it means that the Europeans will burn even more coal because they've decommissioned a lot of their nuclear plants. And even right now, Germany is already talking and floating the idea of possible blackouts come winter because they won't have the energy capacity in order to meet it. They're already paying sky-high oil prices. By the way, what do you think the price of oil globally did at the moment they started discussing this? Went up again. Mm-hmm. So look, this is going to have significant impact on Brent crude. It's also going to disrupt the oil markets even further. I just think it will have the same impact, which is the Chinese and the Indians are like, hey, sell it to us. We'll pay $100 a barrel, which is cheaper than the world market. And then the Indians will turn around and sell half of it to us.
Sell it back to us
at the higher price. And there's some guys in New Delhi just washing their hands and balling out in Mumbai. So I think that's probably the net effect of what is going to happen on this entire thing.
Yeah.
On the diplomatic front, let's go ahead and throw this up there.
This is wild. Yeah. Okay, so we had, it didn't get a lot of attention in the mainstream press. But remember, we had reported that when Boris Johnson went to Kyiv and met with Zelensky, Ukrainian press reported that part of his message was, we do not want you to negotiate with Russia. And that was during a time when talks were live. They were meeting, their emissaries were meeting together, I think in Turkey at that point. Not that there was great hope they were going to come to some deal, but Boris Johnson personally went there to deliver this message to Zelensky. We are not ready for you to end this war. Well, now we have news that Boris Johnson, when he just spoke with Emmanuel Macron
at the G7,
also said, we do not want a Ukraine settlement. Politico's headline is, Johnson warns Macron not to attempt Ukraine settlement now. They say that settling the conflict in Ukraine would only cause, quote, enduring instability, according to the UK government. In a British account of the Paris Sunday encounter at the G7 summit, disputed, by the way, by the French side, Downing Street said Johnson had told Macron such a move would, quote, give Russian President Vladimir Putin license to manipulate both sovereign countries and international markets in perpetuity. This comes after he had urged G7 and NATO allies not to encourage Ukraine to settle for a, quote, bad peace as Russia's war drags on, called on Western powers to give the Ukrainian strategic endurance. That means it's going to last a long time, adding that my message to my colleagues is now is not the time to settle, and encourage the Ukrainians to settle for a bad peace, for a peace for which they are invited to give up chunks of their territory in return for a ceasefire. UK and the US have been pretty much in lockstep with
it's
this
really the
message,
Anglos.
with their policy, with how they think the thing to do is keep this war going and try to bleed Russia dry. You have France and Germany that have been on the other side of that, saying, no, we should be pushing for peace. We should be pushing for diplomacy. And I would submit that if you are interested in peace, if you are interested in avoiding the possibility of nuclear war, France and Germany are correct that we should be pushing with everything we can to get these countries to the table to negotiate a settlement. And the last thing I will say about this is, again, there's a lot of rhetoric from the US government that's very hands-off, like, oh, we're just supporting what the Ukrainians want to do. Total, complete bullshit. Boris Johnson makes it clear we are pushing them in one particular direction, and that direction is for this war to last indefinitely.
Right. I mean, look, if the Ukrainians want to pursue peace, we said this before, how would Zelensky play that in the Anglosphere? If you have the UK and the West being like, no, we don't want you to. He has one interest, remaining in power and continuing the war effort. So his multi-billion-dollar spigot, let's be honest, is going to be turned off completely the moment he goes and tries to meet with Moscow. So we don't have the incentives in the right way.
Yeah.
Once again, the Germans and the French are the ones who are bearing the brunt of this from an energy crisis perspective. It really is an Anglo versus continental split. And in this case, I'm not a huge fan of the continental Europeans, but their security is far more at threat, both energy-wise and national security-wise, than ours is. I do think we should listen to them on this front because they're the ones who are in the driver's seat. And they're the ones who have to live with Putin in their either backyard or front yard in the Germans' cases, not us. Like, we're over here, we're fine. So if you consider it in that perspective, the split here is very important. And I also think this is part of the reason I wish the Europeans would step up more. They have no credibility in these discussions because they don't buy anything. They don't do anything whenever it comes to the conflict. We're the ones who are footing this to 11-1 from a cost perspective. So of course they're not in the driver's seat. You know, Macron can get on the phone and say whatever he wants. Same with the Germans. So they don't show up militarily. They don't show up economically. And then we get to dominate the entire discussion. I don't think that we should be the sole determiners of what happens on the European continent. And I mean, apparently they don't either, but they're not really willing to put their money where their mouth is. So I think it's an unfortunate situation.
Indeed. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.